and welcome to another Casual Friday. Today I want to talk about learning and the limits that we place on ourselves, or the limits that I have placed on myself, either deliberately or inadvertently, and how those limits have either helped me or interfered with pursuing what I wanted to do, with knitting in particular, but in other things in general. So I want to show you a picture I took of my desk yesterday morning. I was in kind of a creative frenzy in my head, and I was like, there was a lot of things going through my head, and I was like, I want to do this and this and this other thing, and I'd start on one thing and then put that down and no, I got to do this, and my brain was going in 800 directions, and I said, okay, stop. To write everything down and figure out what order you're going to do things. Because while I am a very analytical person, I'm not terribly sequential. I tend to have different ideas all over the place, and I try to bring them all together and connect them and see how they work. So when I sat back and I said, okay, hold on a second, just take a breath, I looked at my desk, and my desk is usually a mess, but this was a whole different level of mess. And I really think it reflects what was going on in my brain at that time. There are a couple of different books on my desk that reflected things that either other people had posted on Ravelry and were asking questions about, and I was trying to understand, or that I was posting a question about. I have an idea for a video series that has to do with sock heels, and I was doing some samples on those, and plus a real life one for myself. I had a couple of projects on there. I had an empty Girl Scout cookie box on my desk that I hadn't thrown away because my garbage was full. So I went and got a trash bag, emptied my trash, threw out the Girl Scout cookie box. I had like 10 different circular needles sitting on my desk, put those away. So I put away the things that could be put away and recycled the paper that could be recycled. And I was still left with quite a bit of stuff. And I thought, this really shows how hard I work. Well, it's not like I work hard. I do work hard at it. How much time I spend learning more about knitting. One of the things that I realized, because I was knitting this hat at the time. It was sitting on my desk, or it might have even been on the floor next to my desk. But it was during the process of knitting this hat that I realized some of the limits that I had placed on myself without realizing it. So that's kind of what I want to talk about. When I was in college, I took creative writing classes, a couple of different creative writing classes, but my first class, we met twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, for an hour and a half. And at the beginning of Tuesday morning class, we would have a writing exercise. And we would have to write for 20 minutes. But he didn't just say, okay, it's starting now, write for 20 minutes. He imposed a limit on us. He imposed a single limit on us that we all had to use in our writing exercise. And so I remember the very first one. The first one was, a man enters a room with a gun. What happens next? And I remember thinking, oh my God, well, I'm writing, whatever seemed the most obvious thing to me, writing 20 minutes. And we finished it. And then he made us read them out loud. And I thought, well, this is going to be ridiculous. Everybody's going to have the same thing because we all started with the same sentence. But the point of the exercise was that we didn't. We all came up with a completely different scenario. And it got to be comical because we couldn't believe how wildly different everybody's 20 minutes of writing had been, all by starting with, a man enters a room with a gun. What happens next? So that's when I realized that if you impose some limits on what you're trying to do creatively, that actually can make you more creative. So instead of saying, here is here's a room full of yarn, and here is a bookshelf full of stitch patterns or and needles and all the things you need. Make something. That it's too it's too overwhelming. Like, well, where do I even start with that? And so the idea of placing a limit can be really helpful. Every knitter is different in terms of what it is that they're looking for from their knitting. Sometimes it's like a very specific product that they want, or they want to just relax and they don't want to have to think. They just want to sit in front of the TV and knit mindlessly. Everybody has something different. For me, one of the joys of knitting is learning something new. And each of my projects this past week provided me with learning something new, even though I had knit these projects previously. So the first thing that I finished was a pair of socks. They're very dark. It's a pair of socks for my brother, who I call Sasquatch, or the Yeti, because he's huge. And I had essentially knit these socks before, not the same color, but I knit these socks in September using the same yarn, different colorway. And so it's same kind of heel. So there was nothing new about that. But what I wanted to do was try a different needle. It was right when the Flexi Flips needles were just coming out. They weren't available here in the US, so I bought them. They were called Crazy Trios. I bought from the UK. And so I thought, oh, I'll just get the same size of needle that I had bought, that I'd used when I knit the previous pair of socks. And I'd knit those using Magic Loop. And so these all use the same size, but use Flexi Flips to knit my brother these socks. So I was very focused on learning how to use the needles and use it. So I didn't have to think about what was going on with the sock. And I got most of the way through the leg, and this is early December, so the sun is very low in the sky. We don't have a lot of daylight hours. It is a very dark yarn. I was having really hard times even just seeing what I was doing. And so it was hard for me to, I was trying to measure my stitch gauge, make sure that I was getting the same gauge, and I couldn't see the stitches very well. But I was about done with the leg, and I remember thinking, geez, this is so big. I mean, his socks are usually really big. It just seems so big. Well, I had the other pair of socks that I'd knit from him previously, and I laid it on top, and I went, oh my gosh, these are big. So the first thing I learned was that the Flexi Flips changed my gauge, because I had to change my knitting style to knit with them. So I ripped the whole thing out and started over with fewer stitches and got the correct gauge, and I knit about halfway down the sock. And I wanted to do a review of the needles. And so I had wanted to get a good amount of practice with them. So I did the review, but it was the depths of winter, and I couldn't knit with this yarn. So I put them to the side. And then in February, I knew I wasn't going to finish these. So I thought, well, but when I do finish them, do I want to use the Flexi Flips or not? Because I perfectly am okay with Magic Loop and with regular double pointed needles, no problem with that. So it wasn't like I was really looking for an alternative method that would make me enjoy knitting more. And because I had to change my knitting style, it slowed me down. I thought, I don't think I want to finish these with the Flexi Flips. So I'll need to use a circular needle, but I'd have to use one that's a little bigger than the Flexi Flips in order to match the gauge. And so I had to buy a new needle, because for some reason, I didn't have any US size 2 needle. And so I thought, well, this is an opportunity to try a different needle than I've used before. So I ordered the ChowGoo needles, and I actually had used them in a 7mm size, but I hadn't used any in the sock weight range. So I ordered those, and I finished the socks up, and I liked them. So I learned 2 different things about needles, working on a project that I didn't have to think about the project at all. So that was a really great learning experience for me for that. So the second project that I knit was also one I knit before. It's called the 1898 hat. It looks pretty unassuming here. I'm going to try it on, even though it's probably going to mess up my hair. I knit one of these before for my husband. And what's great about this is they have these built-in ear flaps that cup the ears, so you don't So if it's really cold, like we live in a cold winter climate, when it's windy, the wind can't get in, and the headband part is double thick. It's really cushy. So it's a really great hat, and I had knit it once before. But what struck me about this particular hat is what it has taught me about some limits that I have placed on my creativity, limits that I have assumed about how I need to combine a project with yarn. So my process typically is what is the project I'm going to knit, and then I figure out what yarn I'm going to knit, what to use to knit that project. That's my process, and it's the reason that I'm terrible at buying yarn in a stash, because I'll buy the yarn because I love the yarn, and I don't, not because I see the potential of a finished project in it. So I rarely can figure out what to do. What to do with this yarn, what to turn it into. Once in a while, I'll pair it with a project, and it just doesn't do favors to either the yarn or the project. So what I've come to understand about myself is that I can't go to like fiber festivals and say, "Ooh, what a great yarn! I'm going to buy that." Or if I go to some kind of knitting retreat and there's a yarn market there, I just don't. I don't buy yarn because I've done it in the past, and then I can't figure out what to use for it. So it's either I don't buy yarn or I buy something that's in a single skein, knowing that basically what I'm buying is a souvenir of that knitting retreat or that conference or whatever, that I don't tell myself I'm actually going to use this ever for anything. And so what happened was I was at a knitting retreat, I guess 3 years ago. It was in Port Ludlow, Washington. It was one of those retreats that the Yarn Harlots, Stephanie Pearl McPhee does. She does them 3 times a year, and they always have a theme. There's 3 teachers. They last 3 days long, so you spend a whole day with each teacher. And usually they have one day that's spinning, and I don't spin because I do not want to learn how to spin. And this was the first one they had that didn't have spinning, so I was really excited about it. But they were going to have a day with Clara Parks, who's really an expert on yarn and fibers and that kind of thing. And so she was going to be teaching a lot about yarn, and that I thought was that was something I thought would really be helpful, because that's my weak area. In terms of the whole knitting thing. So I went to this retreat, and they had the yarn market, and I was like, I'm not buying anything, but I didn't have anything else to do. Like, everybody is in the yarn market, and okay, I'll go look through. So there was a table there of this woman who she would reclaim cashmere. So she'd buy cashmere sweaters from thrift stores or wherever. She'd rip them out, and then she'd over dye the yarn. So you'd get these really amazing colors. And it was like kind of fingering weight yarns. And there were 2 of them that I really liked, 2 single skeins. And I thought, well, this is probably enough maybe someday to knit a hat, maybe if I ever figure out. But mostly I just wanted some cashmere yarn in these beautiful colors. And I just accepted that that's what was going to happen. And it stayed on my shelf for a year and a half. And then last year, I decided to knit my husband a secret gift, which I never do. I do not do secret gifts, because often the response is, "Oh, thank you." So I prefer to collaborate. And I had collaborated with my husband for a number of different hats, and I really wanted to knit a hat called the 1898 hat. I had seen it on Ravelry. People talked about how great it was. And so I was reading about it. I downloaded the pattern. It'd been sitting on my desk for months, and I really wanted to knit it. And I thought, oh, I'm going to knit it as a surprise gift for Hanukkah, and he won't know it. And so I'm like, I wonder, what do I have in my stash that might work with it? So I was looking, and I saw that cashmere yarn, and it was the color that I thought he would like. And I thought, well, I can double it up to make it worsted weight. And I knit the hat, and I'm like, oh. Well, if he doesn't want it, I'll take it, because I could use it at the dog park, because I'm out at the dog park 45 minutes to an hour every day. And it gets really cold in the winter because it's next to a lake. The wind blows off. So I surprised him with that. He was totally surprised. Like, when did you make this? And he really likes it. And he rides his bike to work in the winters when he can, when the streets aren't icy. And it's his favorite hat for that. So that was like the one time when I had been able to use a yarn that I had stashed without any idea and then be able to find it. But still, I started with the project and then I looked, what do I have? Do I have any yarn here at home that I could use? And if I didn't, I was going to go run to the yarn shop. So it just happened to work that way. And it just so rarely happens for me. And part of the reason is that what I tend to knit is a lot of texture and cables. So I'm starting with the project, I'm starting with complex cables, and really the only decision I'm making when it comes to the yarn is the color. Like, oh, what color do I have? So again, I look in my, it's the one kind of thing I will stash sometimes is solid color, smooth, worsted weight, 4-ply yarn that works really well with cables. It's sort of a nondescript basic yarn. There's nothing special about the yarn because what I'm using the yarn for is to make something special with the texture. So it's really my comfort zone because I start with the projects, I'm starting with cables and then I work and it's what color do I want? Do I have that color? No, let me see who does have that color. So I've placed this limit on myself sort of consciously, knowing that that kind of yarn is going to work really well with the cables. Like I'm going to start with a cable thing. And so therefore that I don't have to think about that yarn. But then I run into trouble. I can't go to Yarn Festival and buy anything with an understanding of what I could use it for. Even if it was something like, oh, this would make a great, cowl of, I don't work from that point of view, and I don't do the hand painted color single skein accessory projects. That's not really something I tend to do. So that's not something I look at. So I'm more interested though in yarn construction and then what different breeds of wool can do. Well, so when I was at that retreat in Clara Parks, I learned so much from her. I mean, a lot of it was like so new to me, I couldn't retain all of it, but it gave me something to build on. And then she came out with a book. I want to get it. So Clara has this book here, the Knitter's Book of Yarn. And I bought it when it came out. After I took her class, I followed her on Twitter and signed up for her email list. And she has this book, and so I bought the book and never opened it up. Well, then when I was at I had to get buttons for the sweater that I finished last week. I went to the shop closest to me to look for buttons, and that was what I was going to the shop. I was not there to buy yarn. I had nothing. I was there to buy buttons. So I'm like, where are the buttons? And had my sweater on the floor. Sitting next to the button, they have them in tubes, and I'm pulling them out. Is there enough? Is there enough? And trying to figure it out. And this woman came up and said, "Can I help you? Oh, this beautiful sweater. What are you doing? I'm trying to find buttons." So she really helped me. And she said, "Oh, have you been here since the ownership changed over in December?" And I said, "Yeah, I was here once, and it had been switched around, but it's even more switched around now than it was." She's like, "Yes, we've got," and she really wanted to tell me all about the yarns, which I wasn't there to buy, but I wanted to get my buttons figured out. And so after that, she's like, "Oh, okay, well, all of the yarns that we have," she starts telling me all these new yarns that they had gotten in that I'd never heard of. And I thought, what's really interesting that they're carrying yarns I'd never heard of, because I'd done the shop hop last spring, and it seemed like most of the shops in the Twin Cities were all carrying a lot of the same yarns. So it's like the same thing. I thought, well, that's really interesting because it's close to me and they have different things, but I'm not in a yarn shopping mood. But she was persistent. She's like, "And we're having this Wool Folk trunk show now." And she shows me this big display of all the yarns, and I look up, and my first impression is that's not a palette that I would knit for myself. It's very muted tones, very neutrals, but one of my daughters, that's what she wears, And then most of the men I knit for are going to want neutral. So they're like beiges and browns and grays and blacks and different blues. And there's probably some other kind of colors too. But, I tend to be like really bright, like purples and magentas and reds. And, I really like the deep, bright colors. And that's not what that palette was. But I was kind of taking it in. She was telling me all about all this information about this yarn company that I was not absorbing at all. And so I was just looking at it, and I had in my mind that I wanted to try other yarn constructions. I tried blow yarn earlier in the year inadvertently. Somebody had said, I want you to knit this for me and with this yarn. And I was like, oh, this is cool. And so I saw this yarn hanging in front of me, and I'm like, oh, is that a chainette yarn, which is basically like an I-cord. It's like yarn made that's an I-cord. And I reached out for it and I put my hand on it and I was like, what is this? It was like so springy and it was so soft. And I was like, what is this? And so she told me what it was, and I was looking at it, and I knew that I needed that yarn. I wanted to buy that yarn, but I didn't know what color I was going to buy because I didn't know what I was going to use it for. I was going to have to knit for somebody else because it wasn't a color palette that would be for me. And I didn't know anything about the yarn. I didn't know how much I would need. I didn't know anything, but I knew it was going to come back. But it was at a shop. It wasn't at a yarn festival. It wasn't in a yarn market at a retreat somewhere where this was my one shot at getting it. I knew I could come back. So I went home and I looked in Claire's book. There's nothing about chainette yarns in there. She has tons of information about plying and worsted and wool. Tons of information. But she didn't talk specifically about chainette yarn, but she had done a review of this yarn online that I was able to find. And I looked on Ravelry, like what were people using this yarn for? And then I'm like, what could I make out of this? And what had other people used to make this with this yarn? And I saw a bunch of people had made an 1898 hat with it. I was like, oh, that's a good idea, because that's just like the cashmere. It feels just like the cashmere that I'd used to make the hat for my husband. And I thought, well, that's an interesting idea. And then I remembered, oh, my mom's husband, his birthday was last week. I never knit him anything because I was finishing all my projects. And he had asked me for a hat last fall. So I thought, I'll make him an 1898 hat with that yarn. So I went back and I got the yarn. So then I spent time, because I had to get 2 hanks of it, 2 50-gram hanks. And I thought, well, how do you even join this together? One chainette to another. So it's figuring that out. So I had a lot of fun playing with it. But what I realized is how much I miss out on learning about in an area that I just don't know very much about. I've self-limited because I'm always starting with the project, and the projects then are really served well with a specific type of yarn. I just haven't explored very much. So I decided, well, this hat has really taught me a way to go about trying out new yarns. And I also thought about the fact that when I was a new knitter, and I was very enthusiastic and wanted to design my own things, and I'm like, and I didn't know how to do it. So I thought, well, I'll just take that sweater pattern, but I'll apply all of these other stitch patterns that I really like, and I'll follow those directions. And it was okay when I was following, just like to a certain length, but when I had to do decreases at a particular rate and I had different stitch counts, I didn't know how to accommodate that. And so I thought, oh, I have reached the limit of my ability. I am not a designer. That's something only special people can do that have had specific type of training. I can't do that. And just like I follow recipes, or just like when I sew, I follow the pattern, that's how I have to knit. And I decided that was and I did buy some design books, but I couldn't there was a gap of what I knew that I couldn't cross. So when I started the Master Hand Knitting program and they said, knit a swatch this big using this stitch pattern, use another swatch this big using these other stitch patterns. Now do a third one with, they give me very specific instructions for swatches. And then they're like, now measure them, now calculate the gauge, now answer these questions about what you know. And it was like, oh, this is a thing where you need to swatch and you can decide, well, if it's this measure, if I have this measurement and I need it to go to that measurement, that's, you use decreases, and you know, it just like the lights went on and I realized there was a way for me to cross that gap and do this thing that I thought I couldn't do. So what I think I need to do with yarn is the same thing. I need to just buy yarn and not buy yarn thinking, what can I make with this? Just buy the yarn. And, you know, there's always more yarn. And I have to, you know, let go of the idea that either, you know, if I'll lose, if I don't buy this now, I'll never have that chance again. But that I can buy yarn with the idea that what I'm going to do with this yarn is learn what this yarn can do. And so if it's a different breed of sheep, that I can swatch. And that's my project with that yarn, is swatching. And it's like, it's a revelation that I had, that I can't believe I didn't have this before, because I don't know why I didn't have this before, but that's what I learned from this hat this week. There are different ways to give yourself limits to expand your creativity, and I needed to think about what a different way of thinking about what my project was. You know, I was thinking about actual product rather than just a process. Thinking about using this yarn to go through a process that would teach me something that I could then use the next time I go to a festival or a yarn market. And I know that I still need to know what I'm going to do with the yarn, but if what I'm going to do with the yarn is swatch, that's all I need to know. So I love to learn, and the main thing that I reminded myself of this week was that sometimes I need to think smaller and place some limits on myself, and not look at yarn and think, what can I make out of this? But just, what can I do with this in a swatch? That might be enough, and I can learn an incredible amount from that. That's it for this week's Casual Friday. I hope you think about the limits that you're placing on yourself, either deliberately or inadvertently, and how you can get around some of the barriers that may be blocking you, and how you can take advantage of limits in order to expand your creativity. If you'd like to watch any of my other Casual Friday videos, they're over here. On Tuesdays, I do technique videos, and you can see one that YouTube thinks you might like to watch up here. And if you haven't subscribed already, you can click up here. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.